I'd like to kick this off on the heels of Make America Great Again, because this being such a triggering thing, I'd like to make this real. What does that America look like? That great America. Please describe that to me in your eyes. So hi,
it
everybody.
looks like everyone in this room here tonight. Seriously, you know, it's a pretty incredible thing to be able to go and visit with people like you in all different parts of the country, and it is so hope-inspiring because of the thing that brings us all together. So when we talk about Make America Great Again, what is that? All of us here come from different backgrounds, different walks of life. We all have our own stories, our own experiences, but what is the one thing that brings us together? It is our sincere and deep love for our country, and that we cherish deeply freedom and the ability for us to live in a peaceful and safe country, to be able to live out our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to make our own decisions for ourselves. You know, living in a country where we have clean water to drink and clean air to breathe. Living in a country where we don't have to live under this dark cloud of looming nuclear war closer than we ever have been before. Living in a country how you were raised, Danica, as your parents taught you, my parents taught us. I grew up working in our family's little restaurant in Hawaii, a small business. You go out and you work hard and you can live that American dream. All of this centers around our ability to live free in this country that we love.
You know, I came out of the Democratic Party, and in 2016, I shared the impression that many Democrats have about what MAGA actually meant, that it was vaguely racist, that it was intolerant, that it was isolationist, and that it was about making the rich richer. And I've come to know President Trump and to know so many of you. I've met all across the country. And I've come to have the exact opposite impression about what MAGA really means. Making America Great Again is about returning to the 1960s when my uncle was president, when America was the wealthiest country in the world. We owned half the wealth in the world. We had a booming middle class that was unlike anything that had been created in any nation, existed in any nation in history. It became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. We had, if you lived in this country, there was a promise to you that if you worked hard, if you played by the rules, you could purchase a home, that you could raise a family, that you could take vacations, that you could put something aside for your retirement. We were a moral authority across the globe. We were resisting the military-industrial complex. My uncle kept all American soldiers out of war. He never sent a combat troop abroad to die or to fight. And he said that he didn't want people in other countries, in Africa and Latin America and Asia, children in those countries, if they heard about the United States of America, to think of a man with a gun. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted them to think of the Alliance for Progress, USAID, the Kennedy Milk Program. These programs in which the U.S. projected economic power abroad rather than military power, where we were raising up, we were end-running the oligarchies, the military juntas in those countries, and we were helping the poor in those countries to lift themselves up and create their own middle class, which is the only basis for a stable democracy. My uncle said that the primary job of a president of the United States was to keep our country out of war. And he understood that. every empire in history has collapsed because of one issue of trying to support an overextended military abroad. And our extension of our military and all these forever wars has not strengthened our country. It has made us weaker. It's made Americans less safe all over the world and less secure and poorer at home. And because of those programs and those commitments, there are now more statues to John Kennedy, more boulevards named after him, more avenues, more schools and universities and hospitals in Africa, Asia, and Latin America than any other president of the United States, and more probably than all the other presidents combined. And that was a strong foreign policy. We were addressing the places, the civil rights, and other issues in which our country had fallen short of its ideals. So there wasn't a desire to cover those things up. There was a desire to remedy them, to make our country live up to our ideals. And that's the vision that I've come to know Donald Trump and personally, and you push beyond all the defamations and the pejoratives and the image that has been created about him in the American press, and the same thing was done to me. Oh, and I understand that you can't believe everything that the general impression that you hear from the mainstream media about anybody. And the more that I've gotten to know Donald Trump, with his family, and I've seen him in action, I've seen his idealism, I've seen his love for our country, and I've seen and I understand the kind of nation he's trying to create, and it's the same nation my uncle is trying to create.
Fight, 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 right? So why do you think that so many unique individuals, of course, including many that have been Democrats, both of you are those people, why have all of you come to support Donald Trump?
You know, pretty simply, we could go into, the story about why I left the Democrat Party, but over 20 years ago when I joined the Democrat Party, it was once that big open tent party that celebrated free speech, that stood up and defended civil liberties and civil rights. It was a party that welcomed people from all different backgrounds and recognized we can have agreements and disagreements on issues, but as we come together around our core principles in the Constitution and fighting for working people across our country, defending free speech, standing up for peace and prosperity for all Americans, those were the core ideals. But you fast forward to where we are today, and the Democrat Party, unfortunately, is completely unrecognizable. And so when we look at, speaking for myself, why I've endorsed President Trump in this election and why I will do everything I can over these next 44 days to encourage others to vote for Donald Trump, because really when we look at what is at stake, it is nothing short of our ability as Americans, regardless of political affiliation, to truly live and thrive in a free, peaceful, and prosperous nation. And I know in our conversation we'll go into a little bit more detail on that, but when we recognize that that is what is at stake, we also then must recognize that when we compare and contrast the record of Donald Trump as president, and we compare that to Kamala Harris's record as vice president, we see a record of success under Donald Trump when it comes to freedom, peace, and prosperity. And we see a record of failure when it comes to Vice President Kamala Harris, when it comes to tyranny, war, and economic hardship. In this election, the choice is very clear. And it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree on some issues with President Trump. This is not about personalities. This is nothing short of our future and our freedom on the line. And President Trump is our best hope to defend that freedom, to defend our future, to walk us back from the brink of World War III and nuclear war so that we can live out that promise that the founders of our country had for every single one of us as Americans.
Well, Tulsi and I followed the same evolution. She got awake a little faster than I did. And I would add Elon Musk and so many other people to this list.
Do you mind, Bobby? How many former Democrats or independents, libertarians we got here in the room tonight? Awesome. Thank you. So you know what we're talking about.
In the Democratic Party that we were raised in, the Democratic Party of John Kennedy or Robert F. Kennedy doesn't exist anymore. The Democratic Party that I grew up in was the party of peace. It was against war. My father died running against the Vietnam War. My uncle spent 1,000 days in office fighting against his military-industrial complex, his intelligence apparatus to keep our country out of war. It was the party of constitutional rights, of civil rights, including, especially, beginning with freedom of speech. It's now the party of censorship, and it's the party of war. And, you know, Kamala Harris said in this extraordinary speech, as she did in front of the Democratic Convention, which was filled with this pugnacious belligerence, this promise to make America the dominating power, military power in the world. And this is what's gotten us all into all the trouble. Before her, immediately before she went on, we had an ex-CIA director, Leon Panetta, speak at the Democratic Convention. This is not the Democratic Party that I grew up with. I would never do that. It was all kinds of military generals speaking at that convention. The Democratic Party in recent days, including Vice President Harris, has touted the endorsements of Dick Cheney and John Bolton and 225 other neocons who have endorsed Harris against Trump. Well, those people are the people who brought us the Patriot Act. They brought us the surveillance state. They brought us the censorship state. They brought us the torture regimen, the extraordinary renditions. They brought us the Iraq War, the biggest foreign policy debacle in the history of our country. They have not. Dick Cheney has not changed his minds about those policies. None of them have. They still believe that those were all good things for our country. So when they endorse the Democratic Party, it's not because they've changed. It's because the Democratic Party has changed radically. Our party was a party of tolerance, and today the Democratic Party is the party of hatred and division. And, you know, I have many, many old friends. Most of my old friends are Democrats, and I don't hate them because they're supporting Harris. I think they're wrong. I think it's a bad choice, but I don't hate them for it. I don't consider them deplorable, but they consider me deplorable for supporting President Trump. We ought to be able to talk with each other without hating each other. And the Democratic Party prided itself on being able to win debates and to be able to have conversations with journalists and enunciate a vision and defend their records. And now we have a Democratic Party candidate who won't go to unscripted interviews, who cannot explain her policies. And, you know, I like what Tulsi said about, if you want to know the difference between the Democratic Party and the MAGA movement, look at the state of California, the state that I live in now. This is a state that has the highest homeless rate. Half the homeless people in our country live in California. To me, the greatest city in our country was San Francisco, and today it's a ruin. It is the state with the worst, second worst education. It was the top education system in the country. Now it's 49th out of 50th. There's 1 million people a year in California who are leaving the state. They have run out of U-Haul trucks. And Kamala Harris was instrumental in creating that situation. So the Democratic Party that I grew up with was the party that defended the most vulnerable people in this country. And today it's the party of the rich, the super rich. It was the party of the firefighters, the cops, of labor. We had this year this extraordinary inversion happening where you had Sean O'Brien, who I talked to a few minutes ago, who's the head of the Teamsters Union, and he told me to send his love to Donald Trump. And while they had military leaders and CIA leaders talking at the Democratic convention, you had Sean O'Brien, the head of the Teamsters Union, talking at the Republican convention. And the Democratic Party, when I was a kid, the Democratic Party owned very little money. Usually the contributions were a half to a third of what the Republicans raised in presidential races. Today, it's a complete inversion. In 2020, roughly 50% of the people in this country voted for Democrats, according to what we're told, and roughly 50% voted for the Republicans, but the 50% who voted Democrat owned 70% of the wealth in this country. The 50% who voted Republican owned 30% of the wealth. And if you look at the campaign finance, I was looking at the reports for both parties on the way over here tonight, on the way on my drive from Phoenix. And the Democrats have outraised the Republicans 2-1 or 3-1 in this race. And it's not because of enthusiasm. We got much bigger crowds than they do. We have much more intensity than they do. There are none of the surrogates for Vice President Harris who can put together a crowd like this, a standing room only crowd with 3,000 RSVPs we got to this event. They can't do that. What they have is money. And this is the opposite. This has become the party of the working class, of the working poor, of Main Street, of small business people. Kamala Harris's brother-in-law, who is her campaign manager or finance director, has taken leave of being the general counsel for Uber, one of the most anti-union, anti-labor organizations in this country. They are on the side of big tech and the intelligence agencies, because they are all linked. And I'm scared of those people running our country. That terrifies me. We were the party of peace. Now the Democratic Party is the party of war. They're the party that gave us Ukraine. They're the party now that is threatening to put missiles into Russia, to the Kremlin, to mainland Russia, and start World War III. My uncle did everything in his power to avert a conflict with Russia, including doing something nobody ever did, but to have direct contact with Khrushchev. They exchanged 26 personal letters. My uncle put a hotline in the White House so he could talk directly to Khrushchev. In the White House today, nobody's talking to Putin. Nobody's talking to the Russians. Nobody's listening to what they're saying about the red lines that we are creating. And it's really, they've brought us now to the brink of nuclear war. We're closer to nuclear war than any time that we've been since 1962. And it's terrifying for me, the leadership in the White House. If there is a nuclear exchange, 5 billion people will die. A full-blown nuclear exchange with Russia and China would be over, the World War III would be over in 73 minutes, and 5 billion people around the world would die. And, you know, all of the worries about climate and everything else are dwarfed by the worries of nuclear war. And they have us right at the brink. So it's a different party, and we've had this extraordinary inversion now, and this is now the party of the values that I cherish.
We're going to get to war in a minute, but I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about the American people and talk about what they face every day, which is the challenge of buying groceries, the challenge of mortgages, buying houses, or even the idea of it, maybe hoping that their kids could buy a house someday, childcare, and being able to just take care of their family. What needs to be done to be able to control these out-of-control expenses and get people to be able to live a good life again?
The inflation is caused by the Fed overprinting money. And they overprinted money because of a change in our democracy. It used to be that when a political leader wanted to go to war, and this is in our Constitution, they had to go to Congress and the American people. And they had to get the tax allocations. They sold us bonds during World War II. All Americans were involved in the decision. They had to come to us and ask us permission, but they don't do that anymore. They just start a war, they fund it, they've spent $200 billion to Ukraine without congressional authorization for that war. We are at war, by the way, and Putin has said if you put a missile into Russia, we are at war with the United States of America. So, and those wars, it's an undeclared war, but we're going to make it happen. And what they do now is they just print the money, and then they charge us not through a tax, but through inflation, which is a hidden tax. And it's a tax on the poor, it's a tax on the middle class. It's a mechanism for shifting wealth upward to this new oligarchy of billionaires. And that is what caused inflation. The other principal cause of inflation is the money that we're spending on chronic disease, which is $4.3 trillion a year. It's 5 times our military budget. We're adding $1 trillion every 90 days under the Harris-Biden administration to our $36 trillion national debt, and that is ultimately the cause of inflation. If we want to restore our economy in this country and the affordability of our lives, we can no longer cut our way out of that kind of debt. We have to grow our way out of it. We have to grow our national economy, our GDP. Is the only way to do it. And the way that you do that is reallocate. You cut. We can cut the military in half. With the military budget, we were told in 1962 that when the walls came down in Russia, in Eastern Europe, that we were going to get a peace dividend, and that the military budget was going to be cut from $600 billion to $200 billion, and that we were going to bring that money home and regrow our industrial base. We didn't do that. Instead, military budget today, if you include national security and veterans benefits and foreign aid, which is military aid to Ukraine, etc., it's $1.3 trillion. The money we give directly to the Pentagon is about $900 billion. We can have a stronger national defense with half that money. We can arm ourselves to the teeth at home. We can protect the sea lanes. We can protect the neutral areas like the Antarctic, and we can have a 2-strike defense around the world. Right? But at half the money that we spend, about $500 billion, it has nothing to do with national defense. It has to do with global domination, which is the agenda of the neocons who now run the Democratic Party. We need to bring that money home and begin regrowing our industrial base. And I'll give you an example. Every $1 million that we spend on military production, on weapons production, creates 2 American jobs. Every $1 million we spend on child care creates 18. If we want to regrow our GDP, it's about regrowing goods and services at home. It's about bringing the money away from military production and building our industrial base here in the United States. And that is President Trump's plan for making America great again.
You know, that really does draw a stark contrast between, and it really sickens me every time I've heard Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and other neocons in Washington say this, but they tout and try to sell their hundreds of billions of dollars they're sending to this proxy war against Russia to Ukraine as though it is their American jobs plan. But of course, they're not letting us know what is the fraction of a percent that's going out of all of that money that's coming out of our pockets to the people who are working here in our factories here at home. What a sick mindset for leadership of our country to have, to say, hey, yes, we should go wage some more wars so we can create more American jobs here at home. What I appreciate about President Trump is he approaches solving problems with a common sense approach. I had an interview earlier today with a reporter who was asking the question about some of the proposals and the policy ideas and promises that President Trump is making on the campaign trail with regards to our economy. And the reporter was asking, are these policies really considered quote-unquote conservative? What I appreciate about President Trump is his first thought is, how do we fight for the American people first and foremost? And how do we do so using our common sense? It's common sense, no tax on tips. Makes sense to me. Common sense, provide a child care tax credit. Makes sense to me. Common sense, invest in small businesses. Invest in those who are working hard and creating jobs right here at home. President Trump has shown throughout his life and throughout his first administration, again, you don't have to take my word for it. We can look at the facts and look at the record. Our economy was booming under President Trump's administration. The cost of living was far lower under President Trump's administration. The cost of fuel was far lower under President Trump's administration. In almost every metric that you can look at of economic prosperity versus economic hardship, you can attach President Trump's face and name next to economic prosperity and Kamala Harris next to economic hardship. The ideas that she is putting forward, Bobby covered very clearly and thoroughly how their plan is to continue to wage more wars, which further drain our resources and make us far less safe in the world. The fact that she is celebrating the support of someone like Dick Cheney tells us all that we need to know about what kind of commander-in-chief she will be. The fact that President Trump is welcoming people like Bobby Kennedy and myself and so many others from across all party lines shows us what kind of administration he will have and what kind of leadership he will bring. It is inclusive, it is welcoming, and it is centered around those who love America.
Speaking of policies, Bobby, I went to the Make America Healthy Again event in Phoenix this week and heard you speaking about your relationship with him and how that developed into where you are now. And you said that all of the promises at that point moving forward when you guys started conversations, President Trump has kept. So I want to know what those promises are, and you'd share with the Americans here what those promises have been. And you said he has kept them all since, and maybe what other promises he's made.
I got, when it first became public that I was considering endorsing President Trump, I got many, many alarmed emails and texts and phone calls from Democrats and from friends of mine who said, you're ruining your life because he's going to break every promise. Thank you. He's going to.
Charlie Kirk said at the event, Bobby, did you think that you would get this kind of a welcome from at a Republican event and be a rock
me
star?
very happy.
And he said, no.
Yeah, I lost a lot of family and friends, but I have a new family. People said to me, he's going to break every promise that he makes to you. He'll make a deal and then he'll break it. And what I found is I sat down for meeting after meeting with the president, with his family, with his closest aides, and the three issues that and one of the things we agreed we're going to create a unity party, and that, like they do in Europe and parliamentary countries where parties unify with each other to create a government, but they continue to have differences, and they are allowed to criticize each other on those differences and question them. And he was very, very open to that and was very welcoming of that relationship. The three issues that that prompted me to make this switch, were ending the war, ending the censorship and surveillance regime, and making America healthy again. And he made all those commitments, but during our conversations, it was clear to me that these were not just facial commitments. He had a deep knowledge and a deep commitment to each of these. Donald Jr. and J.D. Vance and President Trump all talked about their fear about allowing the neocons back into the government, which surprised me a lot. But they all had a visceral fear that these people are going to destroy our country and destroy the planet. They were absolutely committed to restoring the health of our country for economic reasons, for moral reasons, and just because it's critical that our country to be strong. 77% of American kids are ineligible now for military service because they have chronic disease diagnoses or obesity diagnoses. And that this is weakening our country in terrible, terrible ways, economically, militarily, morally, spiritually, etc. And so they made those commitments during our talks. But he put his money, and he said, I'm going to put you on the transition team, which I didn't ask for. But it was a commitment. And by the way, President Trump told me that the last time around, when he got into office, that he was not prepared to govern, that he didn't really know what came next, that he was immediately surrounded by business, corporations, corporate lobbyists, and they all said, put this guy in power, put this guy in this position. It's 14,000 positions that the president has to fill when he comes into office. And he said, I did what they told me, and it was a lot of bad people. And you know how he talks about bad people. and he said, I'm not going to do that again. And because of that, this time around, the GAO pays for the transition team, the General Accounting Office. But they won't give you any money until you win the election. So you can't start picking a new government until November 5th. And he said that the last time around, that put me in a bind because we didn't have time to vet people and to understand what they stood for and what they were going to do. So this time he went to private donors and he said, we're going to start the transition team 3 months earlier. And he didn't just say that, but they were aggressively approaching us and saying, we're going to have this meeting. We need names for this department, this department. We want your names. We're going to appoint your people. And we've been actively involved. My daughter-in-law, Amaryllis, who runs my campaign, is going to be moving into Palm Beach. The smartest person, somebody said to me the other day, Amaryllis Fox Kennedy is the smartest woman I've ever met. And I said, no, she's not. She's the smartest person that you've ever met. And she is. And she's going to be living day to day in Florida working on the transition team because that's what they requested. So these were not empty promises. Not only that, but President Trump, good to his word, has been out on the campaign trail, and every speech that he gives, he talks about these issues. And they have become now his signature issues. Ending the war, reopening a friendly relationship with China and Russia as trade partners, not one that can take advantage of us, but partners because we need what my uncle called a peace race rather than an arms race. And that's going to be good for the whole world. We need to be projecting economic power abroad like my uncle did, rather than military power, which has gotten us into all this mess. And he talks about that with an eloquence that I have never been able to muster. I'm so impressed with the speeches he's given on this subject, and I urge you to look at YouTube. I take excerpts of these speeches and send them to everybody. I'm astonished by them. He talks about making America healthy again at virtually every speech that he gives. It's often the dominant theme of his speeches. And he talks about ending the censorship and surveillance state. Oh, and people said to me, you better get a contract with him, because if you don't have a contract, he's going to break his word. Well, this is the biggest contract I could ever get. And he is publicly committing to all of you to these issues. And, you know, one of the things that we know, which was very disheartening to me when he got into the White House last time, is that he keeps his word on all these things that he promises publicly. He's not scared to challenge orthodoxies, to defy institutions, to break the institutions that are in his way. And that's what we need, a president who can do that, a president who's not just going along for the ride. And so I'm very satisfied with all the things he's done. I consider that him keeping his word, that he's gone out publicly and endorsed all these issues in front of the world.
Let's talk about censorship for a second. Bobby, I love posting about you, but every time I do, my engagement goes down by half.
I apologize.
It does. I'm going to keep doing it, though. Tulsi, you're on the Quiet Skies fly list, correct? So you're still in the military, but you're on a no-fly list. Yep. That's practical. I mean, the censorship is a real problem that affects so many of us. Whether it's you guys out there trying to speak about the truth that lies in your heart, it gets taken down. Accounts get taken down, words get shut down. This seems like such a big hurdle because it seems like there are so many big companies involved in the data, in the censorship, in the privacy, in all of these things. What is the next step for us to be able to gain our voice, to be able to uphold that First Amendment of freedom of speech?
You know, I think the very first step is making sure that universally we recognize the problem. And the reason for this being necessary and being vigilant in this regard is because they hide their censorship, as they do so many things, under the guise of, we're doing this for you. We care about you so much that we're going to protect you from any information or words or videos that may harm you, that may infect your mind with misinformation or disinformation. We're going to protect you from speech that we deem to be hate speech. We don't want you to hear anything that we think will offend you. We're doing this for your own sake. And this was where, if you remember, during the Harris-Biden administration, they came up with this genius idea called the Disinformation Governance Board. I recently re-listened to the book 1984, audiobook. And what they called the Disinformation Governance Board was the Ministry of Truth. And that's something that is so, and I see a few shirts here about protecting women's sports, something that is so obvious and clear as day to even the smallest of children, that there are biological differences between boys and girls and men and women. According to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's Ministry of Truth, that is not the case. Don't believe what your eyes are showing you. That whatever they want us to believe to be true is the truth. And this is what is so incredibly dangerous, that you have people who are in positions of power today, and they're working with the propaganda media, and they're working with big tech and social media, suppressing accounts or posts that they don't want people to see, and amplifying voices and narratives and agendas that they do want people to see, which is harming our kids, the most vulnerable amongst us. And they're doing this with this mindset that they believe that they know what's best for us more than we do. And quite frankly, that they just don't care. That they care more about their power than the well-being of our children. They care more about the power than our voices and our freedom to make up our own minds for ourselves. To see and hear information and discuss it openly in a public marketplace of ideas as we are gathered in places like this or online. They want total control. And so for people who may not live on social media very much, or who don't watch what's going on with, Matt Taibbi's release of the Twitter files exposing how the White House directed Twitter to censor people's voices who even dared to question their COVID policies. If people aren't paying attention to this, we have to cut to the core of this issue, is that we have in Kamala Harris and Tim Walz directly, and the videos are out there as the receipts, who believe that the First Amendment, our right to free speech and freedom of expression, does not apply to what they call misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And what they're not telling the American people is that they and they alone are the ones who dictate what that speech that must be censored is. We've been experiencing this now over the last 4 years, and it's been an eye-opening experience for so many people. I've experienced it, as you mentioned, Danica. One day after I went and did an interview warning the American people about the dangerous and costly consequences to our country if Kamala Harris were elected as President and Commander-in-Chief, warning the American people about how she would try to mask her insecurity and weakness by projecting strength as a Commander-in-Chief, using my brothers and sisters in uniform as pawns, launching a new war or dropping a bomb here or there so that she could say, you know what, I'm strong. I'm tough. One day after I issued that warning, I was added to a secret domestic terror watch list called Quiet Skies. Political retaliation at its best, which not only is meant to try to bully and intimidate people like me, but the bigger effect is that it sends a chilling message to anyone who is paying attention that if you speak out against us, if you challenge our power and our policies and our greed and ambition for more power, then you too will be punished. The core question here, Danica, is what do we do about this? Keep speaking up and speaking loudly. We defend our right to free speech by using our right to free speech, and not allowing them to continue to try to force us into this culture of fear of self-censorship. We may get a few hate messages on social media, or a lot, depending on what's going on. You may get people calling you names, but in those moments where you catch yourself thinking twice, should I really say this? Should I really speak the truth? Is it worth the cost? Ask yourself that question when you think about the men and women who have sacrificed their lives so that we may live free today. What are you willing to sacrifice to defend our freedom today and for generations to come?
How satisfying was it, Tulsi, to see that clip of Kamala saying there was nobody in an active duty war zone, and then it panned around to show the guys going, well, what are we doing?
I love what Tulsi...
More on that in a minute. I'll let you speak on this, Bobby.
I love what Tulsi said, because the compassion, humanity, security for all of us is always the alibi for totalitarianism. It's always the excuse that they give us. They're helping us. And you know, we've seen in recent weeks, you can go on YouTube and see Tim Walz and Vice President Harris and Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, all saying the same thing. The First Amendment does not protect misinformation and disinformation. So it's the government's job to be the arbiter of what's true and not true, and not allow people, your neighbors, to put dangerous thoughts in your heads. And that the First Amendment is a privilege and not a right. And of course, the First Amendment does protect for misinformation and disinformation. The First Amendment protects truth, but it gives equal protection to lies. And that's how America is designed. We need that. And it's critical for democracy to have the free flow of information, to be able to allow dissenters, people with unpopular views, to talk, because so many times things that are regarded by lies by one generation are recognized by as the truth by the next generation. And it is that dialectic, the clash of ideas, the annealment of argument in the furnace of debate that rises the best ideas to triumph in the marketplace of ideas and give rise to policies. And, you know, the Democratic Party that I grew up with supported the Nazis walking through Skokie, Illinois in 1978, which was a neighborhood that was filled with Holocaust survivors. And it was appalling to them what the Nazis were saying. But everybody understood that we had to be willing to die for the right to say it, even if we didn't agree with it. That's what America's about. And that we can't be frightened of bad ideas. And that, you know, as Louis Brandeis said, the remedy for bad speech is not censorship, it's more speech. And that's how we resolve things in the United States of America. And Tulsi, you know, found out that she was on this list because every time she walked through an airport, she was being surveilled. There were air marshals assigned to follow her, to photograph her cell phone, to watch what she was doing, to monitor her conversations. And some of those air marshals were revolted and appalled. And they became whistleblowers. And that's the only way. And, you know, right now, and the Democratic Party, the DNC has denied, all these leaders have denied that they were censoring Twitter and Facebook, but then Mark Zuckerberg, in front of a Senate committee 3 weeks ago, came forward and said, yeah, they made me censor political speech. We already knew this. I have an injunction against the Biden White House for censoring me. It's a federal court injunction that's been repeatedly upheld. And Judge Doty, who issued that injunction, wrote a 155-page decision detailing the efforts by the Biden administration 37 hours after taking the oath of office, swearing to uphold the Constitution of the United States, including the First Amendment. The Biden administration opened up a portal in the White House and sent emails, which we now have, to all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Google, saying that they had to comply with these censorship diktats. And they opened up a portal and they assigned the FBI to manage that portal so that they could get into any of these social media sites and remove accounts and remove individual posts. And my Instagram account, which had almost 1 million followers, was removed. And Facebook, we have the correspondence inside Facebook. Our executives of Facebook were appalled. They were saying they're making us do things that are illegal, and these are reprehensible people. This is what they were saying to each other, but they went ahead and did it anyway. And they removed my Instagram account. They couldn't find any actual misinformation in my Instagram account. In other words, not a single one of my posts had a statement that was factually inaccurate. We took great pains to make sure that everything I posted was cited and sourced to government databases or peer-reviewed publications. And Facebook pushed back on that and said it's not actually misinformation. And the White House had to coin a new word called malinformation. And malinformation is information that is factually correct, but it is nevertheless inconvenient to the government. And of course, a democracy cannot function if we don't have freedom of speech. And we know this from reading, because we grew up taking civics lessons and we understand that. And we read George Orwell and we read Aldous Huxley and we read Robert Heinlein and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Arthur Koestler. And we know from all of those extraordinary classic writers that totalitarian systems all over the world and throughout history have always begun with the censorship of speech. And that is the first step down the slippery slope to totalitarianism. There is no time that we look back in history and say that the people who are censoring speech are the good guys. They're always the bad guys. And we need to begin teaching our children. We need a president of the United States. If you don't understand that misinformation and disinformation is protected by the First Amendment, and you are disqualified from being president of the United States. And we need a president of the United States. We need a president of the United States who will use that office as a bully pulpit to give us all a civics lesson again and remind the American people that this is the most important right. A government that has the power to censor its critics has license for every atrocity. And we saw during COVID, in January of 2020, they began censoring the doctors. They said people who were injured, people who were differing scientists, the greatest scientists in the world, who were being censored because they were challenging government orthodoxies. And we were told, trust the experts. But the experts were not the experts. They were people who were in the government dictating to us these mandates. We saw that as soon as they realized that they could get away with censoring speech, they went after all our other rights. They went after freedom of worship. They closed every church in this country for a year with no scientific citation. They went after freedom of assembly by dictating a completely unscience-based, which they all admit now, social distancing mandates. They shut down property rights by closing 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation. They shut down jury trials. The Seventh Amendment guarantees every American a jury trial in any case or controversy exceeding $25. But they said if it's a corporation that is doing something, some kind of countermeasure for the pandemic, that no matter how negligent they are, no matter how reckless their behavior, no matter how grievous your injury, you cannot sue them. They took away the Seventh Amendment. They took away a Fourth Amendment guarantee against illegal searches and seizures with all their track and trace surveillance. So we saw the entire Bill of Rights dismantled with one exception, the Second Amendment, and that's probably because it was the Second Amendment. And we need to understand that without free speech, we do not have a democracy, and they'll take it away from us overnight. Those rules, those rights were won for us by a generation of Americans in 1776 who gave up their property, their status, their relationships, their power, their fortunes, and 20,000 of them their lives, to give us those rights. And in 1 year, our government took them all away from us. And I would tell you there are 3 rules that we should all remember. One is that when a government takes a power from us, a right from us, it will never voluntarily relinquish it. Number 2, any power the government takes from us, it will ultimately abuse to the maximum extent possible. Number 3, nobody ever complied their way out of totalitarianism. We need to resist, resist, resist. And we need a president, and right now you're seeing the rise of totalitarian systems all over the world. We saw in Brazil 2 weeks ago them ban Twitter and all these other social media sites and become a totalitarian regime. Europe is now censoring speech openly. We saw the arrest of Pablo Durov, the head of Telegram, when he landed to refuel in France. He was dragged off his airplane and put in jail because of free speech, because they didn't like what was written about the Ukraine war. We see the head of the European Commission, Thierry Breton, threatening Elon Musk that if he has a live interview on Twitter X Spaces with President Trump, the former president of the United States, the nominee of one of our 2 great political parties, that would be violating, that Musk was going to be criminally and civilly prosecuted or penalties amounting to 6% of the value of his company. And what should our government be doing about that? The Biden administration, if we really were promoting democracy around the world as we claim, instead of fighting a war in Ukraine, we should be screaming at the rooftops against these governments and threatening sanctions against them if they censor their people. And nobody in the Democratic Party or our government has spoken out against this atrocity, this calamity. And what we need is a president who will re-educate the public about our civic duty, who will reinstitute civics lessons in our classes that teach people to love the United States of America. And we need to teach our children to resist, 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 and resist until hell freezes over, and then fight them on the ice.
Wow. Wow. All of that. I don't know how many people it takes to do this censorship, but I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty glad that Elon's willing to step up and be in charge of efficiencies. Speaking of efficient, let's talk about the efficiency of our money here in America, and let's talk about war. There was no new wars under President Trump. Since then, there is conflict in Ukraine, the Middle East, war. Billions of dollars being sent overseas. Money that could help us here, help Americans, make America strong again. How are we going to end this war? Is President Trump going to be able to do it as quickly as he said, and what is that going to take?
What we need now more than ever is strong leadership in this country. And that strong leadership that values every American life, that values the lives of our men and women who serve in uniform, and who's willing to do the tough work. Bobby talked about his uncle's diplomacy and finding a way to speak directly to Khrushchev to prevent us from facing a nuclear war at that time. President Trump has already shown through his previous administration that he is that leader. I was a member of Congress at that time, representing my home state of Hawaii. And as you can imagine, we got some local people in the crowd here. Right on. Aloha. As you can imagine, the threat of a nuclear attack from North Korea was a very real one. And so it was very frustrating to me during the Obama administration that they refused to engage in direct diplomacy. President Obama refused to meet with the leadership of North Korea. Why? What I was told as a member of Congress serving on the Foreign Affairs and the Armed Services Committees was, and I'm quoting, "We don't want to reward Kim Jong-un with a meeting with the President of the United States." There's a big open window into how they view themselves and how little they valued us. That those of us who were within range, even at that time, of ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, as we saw North Korea's nuclear capabilities continuing to increase, now they have the capability to reach anywhere in our country. What did President Trump do about that when he took office? He went and met with Kim Jong-un. Why? Because he cares about us. He cares about our lives. He understands the seriousness of nuclear war. Bobby talked about in great detail how catastrophic a nuclear Armageddon would be for all of us here in the United States and the world. President Trump recognizes that. He took action to try to de-escalate those tensions and to try to prevent nuclear war. How did Kamala Harris respond? Well, she talked about it in the debate that they had not that long ago, and she criticized him for engaging in that direct dialogue, that direct diplomacy on behalf of the American people. She criticized him for engaging directly with Putin. Why? To act in the best interests of the American people and our safety and our security in dealing with the other country that has more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world. We hear a lot about the term peace through strength. And very often it's used by neocons who are interested in spending more of our money to build up the military-industrial complex. But what they're not telling us is peace through strength is the strength of leadership that President Trump has already demonstrated in being willing to meet with adversaries and dictators and friends and allies. I almost threw something at the television during that debate many times, but especially it cut straight to my core when I saw Kamala Harris look straight into the camera, speaking to all of us, declaring with an air of victory and confidence that there was not a single active duty service member serving in any combat zone anywhere in the world for the first time this century. It made me angry and it made me sick because I have friends currently who I have served with in war zones who are currently deployed in combat zones as she was delivering those words. It's worse than lies. It's worse than lies. She is the Vice President of the United States. She says that she sits next to Joe Biden in the Situation Room in the White House when every major decision is being made. She was the last person in the room when President Biden made the decision to execute the most disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that we've ever seen, that took the lives of 13 servicemen and women. She stands there with great confidence and talks about how much she cares about our men and women in uniform and what kind of leader she will be as our commander-in-chief. She has shown us what kind of leader she will be. One who didn't care enough to show up and receive the remains of those 13 servicemen and women who were killed at Abbey Gate when they came home. One who didn't care over these last 3 years since they were killed because of her and Joe Biden's decision to even call their families and express her condolences or even apologies for that disastrous withdrawal. And one who stood there and spoke to over 70 million Americans who were watching that debate and said, none of my brothers and sisters are in harm's way today, when many have been killed under her watch, including this year. How can we trust someone who cares so little in the job that she currently has about the cost of war and who pays the price, that she thinks we should promote her to be president? The cost of war is real. I served in a medical unit during my first deployment to Iraq. It was 2005, during the height of the war, when we took an incredibly high number of casualties. That deployment changed my whole life. When I went home, I had left a seat in the state legislature and volunteered for this deployment. When I went home, people thought, okay, good, you're home. Welcome home. You can come back and kind of pick up your life where you left off. But there was no way that I could do that. I was resolved because of that experience and the experiences that I had in deployments that followed, both in the Middle East and in Africa, to be in a position where I could make those decisions about war and peace, recognizing that diplomacy, all avenues of diplomacy must be exhausted, and seeing war as a last resort. I stood with President Trump at Arlington Cemetery on the 3rd anniversary of that suicide bomber at Abbey Gate in Afghanistan. I felt his sympathy and his sorrow as he shared that time with those Gold Star families who were there. I saw in him someone who will keep that promise to take care of our men and women in uniform, to make those decisions carefully, seeing war as a last resort, and doing the tough work to fulfill the promise that he has made to every one of us, to walk us back from the brink of World War III and nuclear war so that we can live free. We cannot live free unless we are at peace. We cannot be prosperous unless we are at peace. And if we allow Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris back into the White House again, we will see not only more war, but we will see that continued grab on our rights and our civil liberties and our freedoms once again in the name of, well, if we are to keep you safe, we have to take your freedom away. This is a false choice that we should never accept. We have to demand more from our leaders to defend our liberty and keep us safe. I've endorsed President Trump because he is our best hope to do that in this election at this dangerous time.
You asked about whether President Trump can end the war as he promises on day one, and the answer is yes. Now, it's going to be a lot, and because we control all the funding for the war. It's our war. It is not. It is a war that Ukraine did not need, that has been disastrous for Ukraine. And we're told lies about that war. We're told lies about the casualties. We're told lies that that Ukraine is winning the war. Ukraine is losing the war catastrophically right now. And within a year, the military in Ukraine is likely to collapse. None of our press is being honest with us about this. They tell us that this kind of comic book narrative about them makes Putin a supervillain, and I'm not defending Vladimir Putin, and he had other choices but to invade. We need to understand, as the American people, our part in the provocations and our part in making this war a proxy war against Russia. And in fact, President Biden was very, very honest about this in April of 2022. When we forced Ukraine to walk away from a peace agreement that was very, very generous with Russia, that both sides had already initialed in Istanbul. And President Biden was asked, why are we going to war in Ukraine? And he said, we want regime change in Russia against Vladimir Putin. Well, that's not for Ukraine freedom. Lloyd Austin, as Secretary of Defense, was asked at that same time the same question, and he said, our purpose is to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. That's nothing to do with Ukraine. And we're told this war began in February of 2022. It didn't. It began in February of 2014 when the CIA and USAID overthrew the elected government of Ukraine and a neutral government and put in power a pro-U.S. government. And the Russians had warned from the beginning, you can never put NATO into Ukraine. We had made a deal in 1992 when the walls came down, and they allowed us to reunify Germany, East and West Germany. They had marched out 450,000 Soviet troops and allowed NATO, a hostile army, to come into those barracks. And the one thing Gorbachev asked us at that time was that we would not move NATO any further to the east, and we promised we wouldn't. James Baker, the Secretary of State, famously said, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Since then, we've repeatedly broken our word. We've moved NATO 1,000 miles to the east through 14 countries, and the Russians said from the beginning, but you can't go into, we don't like what you're doing. We're appalled by it. It's dangerous. But whatever you do, you cannot move NATO into Ukraine. Why? Ukraine has a 2,200-mile border with Russia. It's like Canada and the United States. If we put Aegis missile systems, which we've done in Poland and Romania, these are Lockheed Tomahawk missiles that can be equipped with nuclear warheads. Those nuclear missiles would be 3.5 minutes from the Kremlin. We could decapitate the entire Russian leadership in 3.5 minutes with no time to respond, and that destabilized the whole world. Russia's been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time, Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. We have 0 strategic interest in Ukraine. We have no treaty with Ukraine. The Russians have an extreme strategic interest in Ukraine. We overthrew their government. Putin waited, tried to negotiate an agreement, the Minsk Accords, which France agreed to, France and Germany agreed to, and the Ukrainian government agreed to, and then we pressured Zelensky not to sign it. Zelensky ran in 2019 on a peace platform promising to sign the Minsk Accords, and he won with 70% of the vote because the Ukrainian people wanted peace. They didn't want a war. And when he got in there, we put pressure on him not to sign the agreement. And Russians ultimately went in February of 2022 with only 40,000 troops. They weren't trying to march across Europe as we were told in this country. They weren't. Putin wasn't Hitler bent on world conquest. That's what we were told. He sent only 40,000 troops into a country of 44 million people. Clearly, he did not want to conquer it. What he said clearly again and again, and we never listened to him, I just want you back at the peace table. Zelensky went to Biden and asked him to negotiate a peace. Biden refused. Zelensky then went to President Xi in Russia and asked him, and he refused. He then went to Naftali Bennett in Israel and to Aragon in Turkey, and they said, we'll do it. And they negotiated a new peace agreement in Istanbul, in which the Russians agreed to leave Donbass and Lugansk, part of Ukraine, even though Donbass and Lugansk had voted overwhelmingly to go to Russia. Putin said, no, I don't want you. Let's settle this. And the only thing he wanted was our agreement not to put NATO in Ukraine, because he doesn't want missiles 3.5 minutes from the Kremlin. And we wouldn't either. My uncle almost went to war with Cuba in 1962 when they were going to put missiles 45 minutes from Washington. And my uncle settled that in a secret agreement. He realized that Ambassador Dobrynin told my father, this was not unprovoked. We did this because you put nuclear missiles in Turkey on our border. So we want them on your border for equity. My uncle realized that was fair, and he told Khrushchev, we will remove them from Turkey if you take them out of Cuba. And that's how he settled it, because he was talking directly to Khrushchev. And we had peace. My uncle said, you have to understand your adversary if you're going to have peace in the world. And we do not listen to anything the Russians are telling us. And now and since April 2022, when President Biden, they signed that agreement, both sides, President Biden sent Boris Johnson to Kiev and forced Zelensky to tear up that agreement. And that's when the war started. And since then, 600,000 Ukrainian kids have died for nothing. 300,000 Russians have died for nothing, and we should not applaud any of those deaths. It's not good for the world. It's not good for anything. And now we're talking about we encourage Ukraine to invade Russia. And the Russians were saying from the beginning, Putin was saying from the beginning, I'm scared if you go in there because I'm scared you'll use it as a base to invade Russia. Well, we did exactly what he said. Now we're going to allow Storm Shadow missiles, which are operated with U.S. satellite technology, to hit the Kremlin, hit targets in Russia. 2 weeks. They say we're going to do that. Putin has said, if you do it, we are at war with NATO and with the United States of America. This is World War III. As Tulsi said, the Russians have 1,200 more nuclear warheads than we do. They're the greatest nuclear power in the world. They have better missile systems than we do. They have electronic warfare that is a generation ahead of us. We are operating on a delusional basis, thinking we can win this war. They have hypersonic missiles, which the Chinese do too, and we don't. That can sink every ship in the U.S. Navy because they can't be defended against. I read a Pentagon report last night about their electromagnetic pulse weapons that can make all of our nuclear weapons useless. We don't have that, as far as we know. The Russians do. The Russians have technology. We have shown them all of our best weapon systems, and they have deconstructed them, and they know how to defend against them because we put them in the hands of a second-class army, which has allowed the Russians to capture those and to understand them and understand their defense. We've lost all of our surprise advantages. We've pushed Russia into alliance with China. Russia now has rebuilt its industrial base. It's rebuilt its economy because the U.S. sanctions forced them to build an independent parallel economy, and they've done it successfully. They have almost zero inflation. They have compared to us virtually zero national debt. Putin is at the height of his popularity. We have forced Russia into this very deadly alliance with China and Iran. China has the greatest industrial base in the world. We exported, the Democratic Party exported our industrial base to China. We won World War II. We still think we're in World War II. We won World War II because we had an industrial base in this country. We were making steel and ball bearings and automobiles. We became the arsenal of democracy because we repurposed those to build 56,000 airplanes a year, fighter jets a year, fighter airplanes, a ship a day. We can't do that anymore. The Chinese can. Wow. The next war is going to be fought with drones and hypersonic missiles, which they have and we don't. China has many companies, 100 companies that make drones. Just one of those companies makes 76% of the drones on Earth. We can't fight them, and we're collapsed economically in this country. China's the greatest economy in the world. Russia's economy is booming. They're now allies for the first time in history with Iran. And the people in this White House are delusional. The United States is the only country in the world that wants war. Nobody else does. And we need to start understanding the facts and talking about them publicly. And the United States mainstream media will not tell you any of the truths that I just told you about what's really happening. And we're sleepwalking into World War III.
What is the first and most aggressive way that you would advise President Trump to make America healthy again? What would be that first step that you think would make the biggest difference that you would advise him?
The one thing that is making America sick is corruption in the regulatory agencies. The agencies that are supposed to be protecting public health are not doing that. Instead, their primary priority is the mercantile and commercial interests of pharmaceutical companies, of big food and big agriculture. And they are utterly corrupt from at least the top part of those agencies, completely corrupt. And President Trump has asked me for help unraveling the corporate capture of those agencies, unraveling this corrupt merger of state and corporate power. And we've already put together a team to move into USDA, to move on day one. And save the soils in our country, and to end these. Almost all of our subsidies are going to corn, soy, and wheat, and these become the feedstock for this. We're producing food that is no longer nutrient dense. It's nutrient anemic, and it's creating. And it is the food that is the cheapest, so it becomes the feedstock for the ultra-processed food industry. And that food is the food, 70% of the food that is paid for by food stamps. So it gets a subsidy, agricultural subsidies, and it gets the food stamp subsidy, $70 billion a year, to poison American poor with. It gets the school lunch program. 70% of that is going to ultra-processed foods. And we are systematically sickening our children. And the greatest asset, the most valuable asset in our country today, if you're an insurance company, if you're part of the medical complex, hospitals, etc., if you're a pharmaceutical company, the most valuable asset is a sick child. And that's why our kids are the sickest kids in the history of the world, and the sickest of any country. We have these raft of neurological disorders that I never saw as a kid: ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, sleep disorders, ASD, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, autism. We have autoimmune disease, explosion, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Crohn's disease, all these exotic things that didn't exist. Diabetes. When I was a kid, the average pediatrician saw one case of diabetes in his lifetime. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walk through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. And all the allergic diseases, peanut allergies, food allergies, eczema, asthma, anaphylaxis. Obesity. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease, and the price for treating chronic disease at that point was $0. Today, 60% of Americans have it, of our kids. And the cost is $4.3 trillion. It's 5 times our military budget. And when I was a kid, my uncle was president, 3.4% of Americans had obesity. Today, close to 70%. And it is destroying our country. We have the lowest fertility rate in the world. 50% of American teens have half the testosterone that they had a generation ago, half the sperm counts they had a generation ago. Girls in our country are reaching puberty at 10 years old to 13 on average. That's 6 years younger than they were a generation ago. And it's the youngest of any country in the world. And this is happening not because Americans suddenly got lazy. It's happening because we are mass poisoning people. Obesity is not genetic. It's not your fault. It's because we are mass poisoning you, and we need to put an end to it. And on day one, we're going to declare an emergency like we did in COVID. But it's going to be a chronic disease emergency, and we're going to get the fluoride out of the water. We're going to get the chemicals out of the food. We're going to get the chemtrails out, the chemicals out of the chemtrails, and there's 1,000 ingredients in our food that are banned in Europe. And we're going to get rid of all those chemicals. And I know how to do it. And
imagine for just a moment, every single one of you were gathered on the floor of the House of Representatives, and you were all members of Congress. And you have a bill that comes before you for a vote that would make it so that frozen pizza qualifies under the daily nutritional requirements of fruits and vegetables for kids in public schools. How many of you would vote yes? How many of you would vote no? This happened. This was one of the first votes that I took as a member of Congress. Exactly. That was my face, too. First of all, this is what Congress is doing. And I had conversations with a lot of people on the House floor that day who'd been there a lot longer than I had, asking the question you're probably thinking is, how in the world does this happen? And why are our members of Congress doing the work of the big manufacturers that make these frozen pizzas that go into our school cafeterias? Bobby talked about corruption. And he talked about the influence of big money in our regulatory agencies and in our politics. They are very directly connected. Does anyone want to guess? I mean, obviously I voted no. Do you think it passed or failed? This is what we're dealing with here. And this is why what we are doing here tonight matters so much. In who we elect as president is someone in Donald Trump who's committed to rooting out this corruption and bringing Bobby Kennedy onto his team to actually execute this. And you saw Sam Brown here who's running for U.S. Senate here in Nevada. It's having people in the House and the Senate who are committed to this same cause. What does Make America Healthy Again actually means? It's things like this. It's things like friends of mine who are going for treatment at the VA, and I unfortunately can't even tell you how many of them have shared this story with me, going and sharing about the challenges they are having, whether it's post-traumatic stress or chronic injuries or chronic pain, and they are literally given a sack full of pills. A sack full of pills. One is to treat this one is to treat the consequences of that one, and this one is to treat the consequences of that one, the negative impacts of this one or that one. And we wonder why still we are seeing so many of our veterans feel so hopeless to the point that they take their lives. What we are talking about here in this incredibly historic opportunity in re-electing President Trump to the White House is to change this sick care system into truly a health care system that cares about us and that sees and understands what a healthy life actually is. It is, yes, our physical well-being. It is nutrition. It is exercise. It is what does it take to live a truly healthy life? It is mental health and well-being. And foundationally, it is the spiritual health and well-being of who we are as people and how we are faring. So much emphasis is placed on gross domestic product, and you hear these statistics being spouted about how successful we are as a country based on employment numbers and GDP and all of these other things. But are we really truly a happy country? Are we a fulfilled country? What are we truly valuing in our society? In order to bring about this change, yes, it requires a complete new clean slate of new leadership that is committed to these principles and these values. But that only happens with us if we do our part. That only happens if not only you vote, but you're bringing 10 or 20 people with you who are committed to truly making America healthy again, strong again, and peaceful and free again.
Amen. I like this America that's shaping up. You guys like this America that's shaping up? I reached out to my followers this week when I was coming here to do this, and I asked them what their questions were. And one of them that came through very commonly was the American people are very concerned about voter fraud. They're very concerned about the legitimacy of this election this time around. So if you guys have any advice that you'd like to share as to how we can, as Donald Trump said, make this too big to rig, how can we do that as American people? If you have any advice, please share that. And finally, why do you think that Donald J. Trump is the best candidate to reclaim America?
Voter integrity is a serious concern and a serious issue. We need to be able to have trust and confidence in the fact that when we cast our vote, that our ballot will be counted in the way that we have cast it. We could do a whole other 2 hours on voter integrity issues in and of itself, which we won't. I want to say thank you to everybody who's standing this whole time for your patience and your endurance and resilience. First of all, thank you. Thank you for being here tonight, all of you. There are very simple solutions that President Trump has talked about in making sure that we can have that trust and confidence again. One of those things, when I was in Congress, I introduced legislation. As soon as I learned how easy it is for even someone in middle school to hack into our electronic voting systems, again, what's the common sense solution to that? Paper ballots. Have a paper record of our vote so that if there's any doubt or question about the result, there is a paper trail that can be used to audit the results of the election so that we have faith that our voices are being heard. Congress still did not pass it when I introduced it and still has not passed it to this date. That's an easy solution. There are other solutions that we can implement very easily, but we got to win first. We got to win first to do all of these things that we're talking about. So here in Nevada, the laws in every state are different. What I am encouraging you to do is two things. Number one, look at all of the ways that you can vote, whether it's early voting, absentee voting. I know some people prefer voting on Election Day. For those of use all means available to make sure that your vote is cast, number one. And the second thing is, look in your phone, think of at least 10 people that you can guarantee are going to go out and cast their vote for Donald Trump along with you. Do it. Actually do it. And if you don't know 10 people who are going to vote for Donald Trump, go and make the case. Talk about the things we're talking about here tonight and convince them about why it's in their best interest and in our best interest as a country to elect Donald Trump, who will be the president to defend our freedom, to make America healthy again, to bring about peace, to bring about prosperity again. We can only make this change if we, the people, lift our voices and make it so. Our founders said our government exists with the consent of the governed. If we stay home or if we wake up on Election Day and maybe you're sick with the flu and you don't feel like getting up, or maybe you get caught in an airport in some other state by an airplane delay and you don't make it back in time to cast your vote on election day. We cannot afford to lose a single vote. We have to lift our voices for Donald Trump, because that is a vote for freedom, peace, and prosperity. Thank you so much.
It's odd to me that this has become such a partisan issue, because in 2001, virtually every Democrat in this country was sure that the election had been stolen from Al Gore and given to George Bush. In 2004, I wrote an award-winning article for Rolling Stone magazine about election fraud in the 2004 election that injured John Kerry, and Democrats all were of a consensus. There was a resolution in Congress about it among the Democrats. In 2016, Hillary Clinton gave an interview to the Atlantic Monthly saying that the election had been stolen from her. In 2020, Bernie Sanders, all his supporters also believe the election has been stolen. So you had Democrats for 20 years who were worried about election fraud, and all of a sudden, after January 6th, it stopped being an issue. If you talked about your doubts about election integrity, you became a MAGA radical, an insurgent. And it shouldn't be that way. This is a Republican and a Democratic issue. We are the exemplary democracy in the world. We had a couple of weeks ago a professor go to Georgia and show how those machines could be hacked in a public demonstration in 6 different ways. Now, we're sitting in a city here that was built on the capacity of American designers to build machines that count and never get it wrong, right? And there's ATM machines on every block in most cities in our country that never give you more money than you ask for. Oh, we ought to be able to design a machine that's unhackable, and we ought to all be satisfied that there is there. But no matter what kind of machines we have, we need paper ballots. And I've been saying this for 24 years. And we need voter ID too. And the Democrats are worried about voter ID, and they have legitimate reasons for doing so, because there's a lot of Americans, and there's tens of millions of Americans, and most of them are Democratic voters, who don't have driver's licenses. So they're elderly people, they're urban people, minorities particularly, and students who tend to vote Democratic, and they believe that any effort to require voter ID at the voting booth is going to disenfranchise tens of millions of voters. Well, the solution for that is something that I've been urging President Biden to do for years, and that I'm going to urge President Trump to do in his first week in office, which is to order the post office and the State Department to distribute passport cards to every American who can't afford them. And I have agreements from Andrew Young, from Reverend Al Sharpton, and many, many other civil rights leaders, that they will remove all of their objection to a requirement of voter ID at the voting booth if we do that. And so this is an easily solvable problem. It's a problem that doesn't have to divide us. And it's a mystery to me about whether, and these civil rights leaders have met repeatedly with President Biden, begging him to do it, and he's refused. So I think we're going to need a Republican in office who will finally fix the voting system in this country. As I said, we're the exemplary democracy. We are the example to the world, the model, the template. And we ought to have a voting system in this country that works, but we're not going to get that unless we get President Trump elected. And a voting system that every American, every Democrat, and every Republican, there are certain states in our country, like New Hampshire, where nobody ever worries about voter fraud. They have systems with great integrity, and they have paper ballots. But some states, and a lot of them are the battleground states, that have systems that that people do not have faith in, and that's just wrong. We need to get President Trump elected for this. We need him to get elected to end the wars, to end our addiction to the warfare state, to end this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that has infected and turned all of our agencies predatory against the American public. That allows those corporations to commoditize our landscapes, our rivers, our waters, to pollute them, to pollute our air. That allows pharmaceutical companies and big agriculture and big food to poison our children and commoditize them. That allows the military-industrial complex to just provide a constant pipeline of new wars that is destroying our country. And those are that end the intelligence apparatus and end the power, dismantle the intelligence apparatus that has turned against the American people and that is turning the world's exemplary democracy into a national security, into an imperium abroad, and a national security and censorship state at home. And there's only one candidate who is even conversant on these issues, who is committed to these issues. And these issues, this election is a struggle over the soul of America. And those of us who love this country and understand it, and understand that these rights have to be protected, we need to fight for these rights by getting this president elected until the rest of America wakes up and thanks us for doing that. Yes. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Las Vegas. You guys have been amazing, so attentive, so passionate. Get out there and vote.
Thank you very much.
Donald Trump for president.
Aloha.
Reclaim America.